Chapter XV. Modern Crucibles. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, and for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads, or in their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. Rev. 20:4. Today is not without martyrs. Men are being tortured, imprisoned and killed for their testimony of Christ. Behind the iron and bamboo curtains, millions upon millions suffer torture and death in every conceivable form. The example of their courage should spark fire in the faith of the men who bear the priesthood. But these Christians do not die in vain. Their testimony shall yet stand as a witness to the nations of the earth. It is under pressure that men display strength or weakness. Temptations and opposition measure a man's faith and fortitude. In a Gethsemane, men must choose between the will or the will of God, and many of those who prove faithful are often brought to Calvary. But it is also in the torment of trial that men excuse themselves from the battle of resistance, and thereby succumb to the temptation of peace at any price. In these trials of life a man's strength is measured. True strength is not measured in muscle or mind, nor in social or financial power, but rather in the mastery of himself. Without overcoming the opposition of evil forces, no man can gain a crown. While American Christians feast and banquet upon surpluses, millions of their Christian brothers are starving under communism. And while free world Christians enjoy a peaceful night's sleep, millions of others are being tortured and beaten throughout the night. Only a few live long enough or ever escape to tell the horrid stories of the persecution and death under modern-day slavery. One such soul who lived to witness the rise and fall of men in these prison camps was Reverend Richard Wurmbrand. He saw many men compromise their faith or abandon it, while a few others nobly defended it to their death. Reverend Wurmbrand witnessed the takeover of his native land of Romania by the communists. He saw thousands of priests, pastors and ministers compromise their beliefs by praising communism when it took over the country. At a special congress of various Christian churches, the communists asked the ministers to arise and speak. Each began by offering praise for communism. They said that Christianity and communism were fundamentally the same and could coexist. Rev. Wurmbrand said, "My wife and I were present at this congress. My wife sat near me and told me, 'Richard, stand up and wash away this shame from the face of Christ. They are spitting in his face.' I said to my wife, 'If I do so, you lose your husband.' She said, 'I don't wish to have a coward as a husband.' Tortured for Christ, page 7. Richard arose to speak, and that was the beginning of his serving 14 years in Soviet prison camps. He was later miraculously released and came to America, where he spoke to a U.S. government Senate hearing and said, 'I received these scars from the communist oppressors you are defending. I have seen many men die under torture rather than turn against God and yield to atheism and communism. There can be no compromise with communism. I saw a Catholic priest die, boasting that a pope would never shake hands with a communist. I am glad he does not know it has happened.' Chicago Tribune, May 7, 1966. Reverend Wurmbrand was a witness to many men who would not make any compromises with communism. Two such heroes were father and son. A pastor by the name of Florescu was tortured with red-hot iron pokers and with knives. He had been beaten very badly. Then he was put in a cell. Starving rats were driven into his cell through a large pipe. He could not sleep, but had to defend himself all the time. If he rested a moment or closed his eyes, the rats would attack him. He was forced to stand for 2 weeks, day and night. The communists wished to compel him to betray his brethren, but he resisted steadfastly. In the end, they brought his son of the age of 14, and they began to whip the son in front of the father, saying that they will continue to beat the child until the pastor says what they wished him to say. The poor man was half mad. He bore it as much as he could. When he could not stand it any more, he cried to his son, 'Alexander, I must say what they want. I can't bear any more your beating.' The son answered, 'Father, don't do to me the injustice to have a traitor as a parent. Withstand. If they kill me, I will die with the words Jesus and my fatherland.' The communists, enraged, fell upon the child and beat him to death, with blood spattered over the walls of the cell. He died praising God. Tortured for Christ, page 20. Again he relates the story of a faithful, devoted Christian girl who left one of those rare and noble examples, never to be forgotten. One of our workers was a young girl of the underground church. The communist police had discovered that she secretly spread gospels and taught children about Christ. They decided to arrest her. But to make the arrest more agonizing and as painful as they could, they decided to delay her arrest a few weeks, until the very day she was to be married. On her wedding day the girl was dressed as a bride. The most wonderful, joyous day in a girl's life. Suddenly, the door was pushed upon and the secret police rushed in. When the bride saw the secret police, she held out her arms toward them to be handcuffed. They roughly put the manacles on her wrists. She looked toward her beloved, then kissed the chains and said, "I thank my heavenly bridegroom for this, the jewel he has presented to me on my marriage day. I thank him that I am worthy to suffer for him." She was dragged off with weeping Christians and a weeping bridegroom left behind. They knew what happens to young Christian girls in the hands of communist guards. After 5 years she was released, a destroyed, broken woman, looking 30 years older. Her bridegroom had waited for her. Tortured for Christ, page 21. Unless someone stands out to leave a proper example, too many others will follow the crowd of conformists. It is apparent that many of the sheep of Christ need someone to follow before they can stand by themselves. Such an experience happened to a minister in Hungary. A Russian army captain came to a minister and asked to see him alone. The boy was very young, very brash, very conscious of his role as conqueror. When he had been led to a small conference room and the door was closed, he nodded towards the cross that hung on the wall. "You know that thing is a lie," he said to the minister. "It's just a piece of trickery you ministers use to delude the poor people to make it easier for the rich to keep them ignorant. Come now, we are alone. Admit to me that you never really believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God." The minister smiled. "But, my poor young man, of course I believe it. It is true. I won't have you play these tricks on me," cried the captain. "This is serious. Don't laugh at me." He drew out his revolver and held it close to the body of the minister. "Unless you admit to me that it is a lie, I'll fire." "I cannot admit that, for it is not true. Our Lord is really and truly the Son of God," said the minister. The captain flung his revolver on the floor and embraced the man of God. Tears sprang to his eyes. "It is true," he cried. "It is true, I believe so too, but I could not be sure men would die for this belief until I found it out for myself. Oh, thank you. You have strengthened my faith. Now I too can die for Christ. You have shown me how. From the book, Through God's Underground. If men compromise or concede their faith, that is the example they leave. It displays a weak and inconsistent faith. A faith which wavers is of course a false faith. See James 1:6, 7, 8, 12. No one is impressed with a half-hearted faith. Men who conform or abandon their faith must first justify their actions. When Holland surrendered to the German army in 1940, many of the anti-Nazi Dutch surrendered and then gave total submission. "Maybe there is something good in Nazism," they told themselves as they saw the tremendous show of German strength. They soon became traitors and collaborators because they were taken in by the show of the enemy's strength and a realization of their own weakness. Other men are subdued by other reasons. One of the officers in the American army was court-martialed for collaborating with the enemy in a Korean prison camp. He justified his conduct by saying that he took such a course of action in order to keep himself and his men alive. Isn't that a perfectly valid argument? However, it was not necessarily true. An internationally famous psychologist, Dr. J. Milou, made an intensive and comprehensive study of the principles of loyalty and disloyalty. He wrote that, "In general, we can say that the person who is honest with himself and shows a minimum of self-deceit, the man who exhibits a stable structure of character, the person with genuine maturity, is most true to himself, and, as a result, most loyal to others. The simple man with deep-rooted, freely absorbed religious faith could exert a much greater inner resistance than could the complex, questioning intellectualist." Rape of the Mind, page 248, 250. One of the noblest examples of Christian faith in our times is reflected in the life of a minister by the name of Harlan Popov. Harlan was one of those little-known ministers who lived behind the Iron Curtain. He soon became pastor of the largest Protestant congregation in Bulgaria and later one of his country's foremost evangelists. But on July 24, 1848, early in the morning, his doorbell rang and 3 men had come to take him to the police station for a little questioning. The result was his spending 13 years in communist prisons and suffering many of their tortures. Harlan had come to that rare point in a man's life which separates ordinary men from the men of God. He had prayed all one night in his spiritual dedication, by saying, "God, my entire life is yours. I am ready to give unto you all I have." He was soon to learn and realize a rare lesson, that to serve him is wonderful, but to suffer for him is an even higher privilege. The communists at first tolerated the ministers of religion, but as they gained control over the nation, the ministers were soon all declared spies and instruments of imperialism. The communists were determined to destroy Christianity, and so they put puppets in as leaders and right-bracket ministers. The faithful ministers were all hauled off to prison. When Harlan Popov was taken to the police station, he stood for 10 days before a wall without moving, without food or without water. He was not allowed to speak or move. On the 10th day he said. Still the collapse didn't come. I lost all track of time. One day blurred into another. My swollen legs became huge, engorged with blood from complete immobility. My lips were cracked wide open and bleeding. My beard was long, for I had not been allowed to wash nor shave since the day I was arrested. My eyes were balls of fire. Yet, somehow I stood. On the 10th night, sometime after midnight, I heard my interrogator snoring as he dozed off. I moved my stiff neck to the right and left. Off to the left about 6 feet away there was a window. Since it was dark outside I could see a reflection in the window, like a mirror. I recoiled in horror. It was a monster's reflection. I saw a horrible emaciated figure, legs swollen, eyes like empty holes in the head, with a long beard covered with dried blood from cracked, bleeding and hideously swollen lips. It was a grotesque, horrible figure. I was repulsed by it. Suddenly, it struck me. That horrible, bleeding, grotesque figure was me. That monster was me. My numbed mind slowly absorbed this fact, and tears came to my eyes. Suddenly, I felt crushed, so alone, so by myself. I felt as Christ must have when he cried, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" I couldn't weep tears, but my body heaved with unwept tears. Then, in that moment of total, crushing hopelessness, I heard a voice as clear and distinct as any voice I have ever heard in my life. It said, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." It was so audible I dared to glance to my dozing interrogator, certain he had heard it too, but he slept on. The presence of God filled the punishment cell and enveloped me in a divine warmth, infusing strength into the shell that was my body. It had a definite, startling physical effect on me. My interrogator awoke with a start. He came over next to me and could sense something had happened. He didn't know what, but he was so aware of the right bracket difference he rushed out and returned with another officer. They couldn't understand it. I heard the anxious whispered voices of the interrogators behind me, trying to figure out what happened. I seemed to be so fresh and alive, infused with a new strength. I have never felt closer to God in my life than at that moment. He became so close to me, my heart longed to see him. I had felt the presence of God so close, and it was wonderful, superior to any feeling I have ever had. It was like a foretaste of what being with God in eternity will be like, and I didn't want to go back. Tortured for his faith, Harlan Popov, 31 to 32. With 2 slices of bread and 6 tablespoons of soup each day, he was placed into a black and wet cell. He had spent 1 year without seeing a blade of grass or a living thing. Night after night he listened to the screams and crying of those who were tortured. Once he spent 9 months in an Ellis pit, and at another time he went 10 days without food or drink in sub-zero weather. He spent 13 years in communist indoctrination classes, but he never graduated. He saw men who turned from God, and he explained that there is no limit to their depravity or to the depths to which they will sink. He learned that prison either destroys a man from within, or it gives him a deep spiritual strength. He came out of communist prisons with the testimony that if there is one certainty in this uncertain world, it is the word of God. Harlan said that man's first reaction to suffering is that it is too hard to bear. But he soon learned that suffering is of great value to a man, and it is often more precious than gold. His resistance became his strength. For 13 years, he heard them say, "We know you are a good person, but you must conform to us and the new society we are building." He said he continually heard the words "conform to us," but he never would. He describes a most unusual experience which happened to him in one of those torture chambers. When all hope seemed to be lost, he gained a testimony worth more than life itself. One day I was taken to a little office where one of the cruelest members of the DS, Comrade N.F., was waiting for me. Standing beside him was a man I had not seen before. He was dark and thin, with extreme-life-fierce eyes and the features of a drunkard. Almost immediately, he jumped on me and began to beat me all over my body. I fell under the rain of blows, while on the floor he kicked me with all his might and screamed horrible obscenities. He screamed, "Popov, we know you. You've been trying to start a plot with the other pastors. We're going to teach you who will triumph over whom." He ordered me taken to the dampest cell in the prison. As I was led out he screamed, "You're going to rot down there by yourself. You'll never see the light of day again. You're a dead man, Harlan Popov." 2 guards led me down to the basement floor of the prison. There, at the end, was a heavy metal door, rusty from the dampness. As I was pushed through it I saw another flight of stairs going almost straight down like a ladder. I descended the steep steps into the cold dark dampness. The only light now was from the guards' flashlights. I felt as though I were descending into the very pits of hell itself. I waited at the bottom of the steps as the guards made their way down the steep stairs. It was inhumanly cold with an unearthly blackness, blacker than I have ever seen before. The guards took me by each arm, led me down a narrow walkway to a cell door. Opening it, they roughly shoved me in and locked it. I heard their footsteps leave, going back up the stairs to the world above. It was deathly quiet and totally black. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I felt around like a blind man, found the tin drinking cup and tapped on the walls, but I got no reply from either side of my cell. I was all alone down here in the black bowels of the earth. Then the enraged communist's words struck me, "You'll never see the light of day again. You're going to rot down there." I resigned myself to being forgotten down here in this deep, forgotten crevice far below even the lowest level, left to rot. And it wouldn't be long before a man would rot here. I felt the walls and they were wet with moisture dripping down. Deep in this forgotten cell so unbelievably dark, I got on my knees and prayed, "God, I know there is no cell deep right bracket enough, no iron bars strong enough to separate me from you. God, be with me. Give me strength." The floor of the cell was so wet from subterranean underground moisture I couldn't lie down. I felt my way around, over to the corner and huddled down there with my arms wrapped around me for warmth and went to sleep. I don't know when I awoke. In such absolute darkness one loses all track of time. It is like being suspended in another world. I tried to measure time in my mind, but it began playing tricks on me. Without some usual references, stars, daylight, shadows, something, a man loses all sense of measuring time. Even the blind have braille clocks, or other means. Imprisoned in that absolute vacuum of black space I had nothing. For the first time in over a year I began to fear for my sanity. Had I been here for a day? Or 20 days? For an hour, or for a week? Only occasionally would I hear a voice, an iron grate would open, and a metal plate be scooted on the floor with a little water and 3 or 4 carrots or a rotten potato with worms in it. I now resigned myself to spending the rest of my life here. Mentally, I had accepted it. One day while I was praying, the hopelessness of my situation struck me full force. Starved, beaten, forgotten here, I knew there was no hope of ever getting out. It was a high-ranking officer who told me I would rot here, and he meant business. Tears came to my eyes. For weeks I had been like this. "Oh, God," I cried. Then something happened which has never happened before or since. A light glow began to shine, and a warming sensation filled the cell and enveloped my weakened, starved frame. I felt strong arms around me, cradling me in the arms of Christ himself. That same voice which I had heard when I had stood at the wall for 2 weeks spoke again. I can never describe that voice. Overwrought with love and compassion, Christ spoke to me saying, "My son, I shall never forsake you. My arms are around you and in them I shall comfort you and give you strength." Tears flowed down my cheeks as I was held in the embrace of Christ. I know some readers may think this extreme, but when I was at the point of madness and despair, Christ let me know he had not forgotten me there huddled in the blackness of a forgotten cell in the bowels of the earth. It was a beautiful loving embrace, and a moment that made all the suffering worthwhile. How I love him! If all men in the world could only know this Christ in his beauty and love. Ibid. Pages 59 to 62. Men everywhere today are making compromises under the guise of improvement, progression or safety. In every field of social, educational, religious or political endeavors, the reconciling and compromising are leading the world into a total vortex of destruction. Even America is selling freedom by a gradual deliverance to the international slave masters of communism. The international communists, through the Communist Party USA and their numerous liberal allies in America, sold the powers that be in high places of Washington, D.C., this damnable doctrine that if the United States want peace in the world, we must constantly seek areas of compromise and adjustment with the Soviet Union and Red China. In other words, the United States should sit still and play dead while Soviet Union rolls over the free world, for if we were to object or resist Red aggression, we would risk war. Unwilling to plunge the world into a nuclear war, we must seek accommodation and/or compromise with the communist countries, giving in to their every little demand for peace sake. All of these terms, peaceful coexistence, accommodation and détente means simply appeasement. Officially, the United States is in the process of appeasing our international enemy. The policy of piecemeal political surrender to the hostile demands of an aggressive dictatorial enemy, such as world communism, is now considered by the makers of our federal policy less dreadful than war. There is no difference between what Chamberlain did in Munich and what Nixon and Kissinger have done in Red China or Red Russia. It is appeasement. They have chosen to surrender piecemeal in preference to an all-out atomic war, but it is surrender and suicide, no matter what you call it. Christian Crusade Weekly, May 25, 1975, page 1, excerpts. Men and nations have generally become corrupted by compromising their faith in God. As faith is weakened, there is a loss of the Spirit of God, and without the Spirit of God, destruction is certain.